For an iOS developer, you actually have quite a few flavors of animations available to you. But the type that we're going to learn about today is called the tween animation. So tween animations involve defining a beginning and an end position of an image or an UI view and specifying the amount of time that this transition should take to complete. Then the computer will automatically plot a path from beginning to end and conjuring up all the images in between in order to produce an animation. So for example, you can do the same thing inside Keynote. So if I pull up a shape here, say a circle, and I want to move it from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, all you have to do is to determine the starting point of your animation, so how you want the animation to begin, and then you can copy the slide and determine how you want the animation to end. So in my case, I just want this circle to be moved from left to right, and I want that to happen over 1 second. So then I can go into animate and specify a magic move, which is essentially a tween animation, and it works in much the same way as the tween animation in iOS. So now I can change my duration to 1 second, and I can even add acceleration, so ease in and ease out acceleration, so it looks a bit more natural. So let's go ahead and preview our animation. This is the starting point, and when I click next, it'll show me an animation going from left to right. And the computer conjured up all the images in between in order to make that transition look as smooth as possible. So let's go ahead and do the same in our FlashChat app. So in our app, the UI view that we want to animate is this send area here. So in this area, we've got a small text field where we're going to enter our message. But in order to enter our message, we need to use the keyboard on an iOS app. So ideally, when we click on this text field, we should be able to expand this view so that it doesn't get obscured by the keyboard. So in order to do that, we've linked up an IP outlet not to a view or to a button, but instead to a constraint. And that constraint is the height constraint of this view. So what we're going to say is that when a user taps in this text field area, we're going to change that height constraint programmatically to a larger size so that we move this text field all the way up here so that it's not obscured by the keyboard. So the first step in that whole process is detecting when the user taps inside this text field. So if we head over to the chat view controller, we can add a UI text field delegate protocol in the class declaration. So it's called UI text field delegate, and you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so we've already declared the chat view controller to adopt the UI table view delegate as well as the UI table view data source. All we need to do is just to add another delegate, and this one is called UI text field delegate. So what this means is that we're setting up our chat view controller to be the delegate of the UI text field. So whenever something occurs in that text field, then it knows to send a message to the chat view controller. So similar to the table view delegate and data source, we also have to explicitly set our chat view controller as the delegate of the text field that we've got in question. So do you remember how to do that? Go ahead and give it a go. So right below the to-do where it says set yourself as the delegate of the text field here, we're going to set our text field, which is called message text field, and we're going to set its delegate property to self, i.e. the chat view controller. Now, once that's done, we're going to add in a delegate method. Now, this method is not required. As you can see, after we put in this protocol, we didn't get any errors. It didn't tell us that there was a required method that we'd forgotten to implement, but it does have an optional delegate method. So we're going to put our text field delegate methods under this pragma mark. And there's two of them that we're going to implement. One is called text field did begin editing. And this gets triggered when some activity is detected inside the text field, i.e. a user is beginning to type inside that text field. So again, we're going to use Swift's search functionality and get Xcode to type everything out for us. So I'm just going to start writing text field did begin. And you can see that Xcode's picked up the right method for us. And it says that this is the method that tells the delegate, i.e. the chat view controller, that editing began in the specified text field. Now the specified text field is of course the one which we set earlier on in view did load, and that's the message text field. So that's linked up to that text field where we're going to type in our message body. So let's just add in that method, text field did begin editing, and we're also going to add in the other method at the same time, which is text field did end editing. And make sure that you pick out the right one because there's more than one. We just want the one that only takes a text field as a parameter, and we don't care about the reason for ending. So we want the short one, so this one. So what we know about our view is that this view, which we want to animate, is currently 50 points high. And we also know that the keyboard is 258 points high. So essentially, when the keyboard pops up, if we want this view to still be visible, then we need to change that height constraint to 50 plus the height of the keyboard. So in the text field did begin editing method, we're going to increase the height constraint to 258 plus 50, which equals, of course, 308. So let's go ahead and set that. So it's going to be height constraint dot constant equals 308. But if you run your app now, you'll see that nothing's actually changed. Even when you click in the text field, the height of that gray view doesn't change. And that's because we have to call on auto layout to update all the views, to redraw everything on screen before this code actually comes into action. So right below where we typed in that line of code, where we updated the height constraint, we're going to call a method on the view, and it's called layout if needed. And that basically just means that if a constraint has changed, or if something in the view has changed, redraw the whole thing. So now if we run our app, we can see it in action. But before we do that, we first have to delete this little placeholder here. Now that placeholder tells us that this is where the code should go, but it's going to break our app if we don't delete it. So let's go ahead and run our app. So here's our chat view controller, and I'm going to click inside this message text field to begin editing. And as you can see, the entire view pops up and becomes a lot higher. So if you hit Command K, you can actually show the keyboard. This is what your app would look like on a real device. Every time you tap inside a text field, the keyboard will pop up, allowing you to type in an input. Now that height increase was a bit jagged. It was kind of going from 50 to 308 in an instant, whereas we want to animate that process. Now the difference is going to be marginal, but it's always the fine touches that make a difference in an app. So let's go ahead and implement some animations. So I'm going to stop the app, and inside text field did begin editing, I'm going to type out a new method. And that method is a UI view method, and it's called animate with duration. And the duration is a time interval in seconds. So let's say maybe half a second or 1 second. You could try it out and see which one you prefer. And for the animations part, we're just simply going to open and close a curly brace. And for those keen-eyed among you, you'll notice that this is in fact a closure. So the animations parameter is actually taking a closure as its argument. And what we know about closures is that we have something called a trailing closure, which means that if the last argument in a method takes a closure, then we can simply close the parentheses and leave the closure as a trailing argument, like so. And in between these curly braces, I'm going to put in the animations that we want to happen. So that's, of course, changing the height constraint and updating the view. So I'm just going to cut and paste inside this curly brace so that all of that happens in an animated way. Now, once I've pasted them in here, you're going to get some errors. And the errors are, if you remember, that because we're inside a closure now, we have to always specify that the method is in our own class. So we have to insert the self keyword in front of both of these methods so that we can get rid of that error. So we're going to add self in front of both methods, and then we're going to run the app again. And now you can see that the change in that height of the view was animated, and it looks so much smoother. And I know it's a small touch, but you're going to be able to differentiate your apps from the million others out there by these small touches. So now that we've gotten this TextField did begin editing method working, I want you to tackle the TextField did end editing. So write a UI view animation to change the height of that message view back down to 50 once we've finished editing in the text field. So give it a go. Okay, so the code is going to pretty much mirror what we wrote up here. And all we're going to write is uiview.animate with duration, and we're going to keep the duration the same, half a second. And the animations are going to be written the same way. We're going to have a trailing closure that includes all of the animations. So the thing that we want to animate is the reduction in the height of that view. So again, we're going to write self.heightConstraint.constant equals, so we made it rise up to 308, that's including the keyboard. Once the text field has finished editing and the keyboard has gone away, then we want to lower this view back to 50 points. And then we're going to call self.view.layout if needed in order to update the views on screen, and we should be done, right? But when you run the app, what we expect to happen doesn't happen. So let me show you what I mean. So when we click in the text field did begin editing, gets triggered and our animation works, increasing the size of this view. But when we click away, i.e. text field did end editing, right, it doesn't trigger that reduction in height, even though we've programmed it to inside text field did end editing. And the reason for that is because this method gets triggered automatically whenever the text field in question detects a touch inside that text field. So whenever you click in the text field, this method is going to trigger and our animations are going to work. But this method doesn't get triggered automatically. You have to call it manually. So when would it make sense to do that? Well, maybe if the user taps away from the text field. And if you have a look at our main storyboard, if they tap away from the text field, then where else are they going to tap? It's going to be somewhere on the table view, right? So what we can do is we can register a custom tap gesture recognizer to recognize when the user taps inside the table view, and when they do, then we're going to trigger our text field did end editing and our animation as well. So in our view did load, we're going to register our table view to monitor for tap gestures, and whenever a tap gesture is registered in the message table view, we're going to call text field did end editing. So we're going to do that just below this to do where it says set the tap gesture here. And we're going to create a constant called tap gesture, and it's going to be set to equal UI tap gesture recognizer. And we're going to open a curly brace, and we're going to select this one where it has a target and an action. So the target is, of course, self, our current class, and the action is going to be calling a particular method. So in this case, we're going to be using what's called a selector, and we're going to write hashtag or # selector, and this is the keyword for triggering a selector. And then inside some parentheses, we're going to call the method table view tapped. So that's the name of the method that's going to get triggered when a tap is felt. And then we're going to add this gesture recognizer to the table view. So we're going to say message table view dot add gesture recognizer, and the one we're going to add is called, of course, tap gesture. Okay, so we've got a warning here, and the reason is because Xcode doesn't recognize a method called TableViewTapped anywhere inside our code file. And that's of course because we haven't written it yet. So don't worry about that error, we're going to go and write it right now. So just below the view did load, there's a to-do where it says declare TableViewTapped here. So that's where we're going to create this new method called TableViewTapped. And it's not going to take any inputs, but it is going to have some functionality. And the functionality is that it's going to call a method called endEditing on the message text field, and it's going to be true. So essentially what our code is doing is that we've registered a new tap gesture, and we've added that tap gesture to the message table view. So whenever the message table view gets tapped anywhere, it's going to trigger this tap gesture. And that tap gesture calls a method called TableViewTapped, which calls a method called endEditing on our message text field, which then in turn calls this method called textFieldDidEndEditing and triggers our animation. So let's run our app and see if all of that code worked. Okay, so we're going to tap inside our message text field and it pops it open with our animation, and then I'm going to tap away from it, so somewhere over here, and it pops it right down. And that's because the message table view has detected my tap gesture and it has called the method TableViewTapped, which calls endEditing on the message text field, and that triggers our animation in here. So the only thing that's new here is this selector. Now, selectors are not complicated to understand, but they're essentially a legacy from the previous language that was used to build iOS apps, and that language was called Objective-C. Now, Objective-C had a lot of nice things about it and also some frustrating things. And selectors, or rather the inheritance of selectors in Swift from Objective-C, is one of those slightly niggling things. But essentially all that it is that sometimes we need to call methods on objects that we don't know about until the app is running, so at runtime. And we use selectors to determine which methods should be called on which object while the app is running. So it's basically a bit of syntactic sugar that we use to coax everything into work. And a lot of times when you see selector, they will be in components that inherited a lot of their code from the way that it was implemented in Objective-C. So all you need to understand in this line of code is that the target is of course the class where you want to receive the tap gesture, which is our current view controller, the chat view controller, and the action takes a selector, so you just write the keyword #selector, and inside some parentheses you include a method to call on the target. So that's all it is, just a different way of calling a method